Hi, I'm Emilio. I'm a program manager at Google. Right now, lots of people are looking for ways to learn new job skills. That's why we created Google Career Certificates, an online training program for fast-growing fields like IT support, project management, data analytics, user experience design, and more. You don't need any prior experience, and you can be job ready in about 6 months. So put your skills to work. Go to grow.google/certificates.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to New Books in Central Asian Studies, a podcast channel on the New Books Network. I'm Nick C., one of the hosts of the channel, and today we'll be talking with Dr. David Brophy about his translation of Muhammad Sadiq Kashgari's In Remembrance of the Saints, The Rise and Fall of an Inter-Asian Sufi Dynasty. That was published in 2021 by Columbia University Press. Dr. Brophy is a senior lecturer in modern Chinese history in the Department of History at the University of Sydney, where he teaches courses in modern China, modern Russia, and Central Asia. He holds a PhD in Inter-Asian and Altaic Studies from Harvard University. And his first book, Uyghur Nation, Reform and Revolution on the Russia-China Frontier, was published in 2016 by Harvard University Press. He's also the co-editor of The Origins of Xinjiang, a set of historical sources on Turfan, published in 2016 by University of Tokyo Press. David, welcome to the show.
Hi, Nick. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and we're excited to have you and to talk about this important translation of Kashgari's work. And this isn't the first Central Asian Chagatai text that we've had featured a kind of translation on the show. So we're definitely excited to continue that trend. But to begin with our conversation today, I'd like to ask you about your academic career, your interest in China and Central Asia, and how you came to this project. And how do you see this translation fitting into your broader research interests?
So I came to Central Asia via China, I suppose. I was a major in Chinese studies as an undergraduate and sort of got to the end of that degree feeling like I really needed to go spend some time in China. I had a bit of an interest in Xinjiang by that time, but only a sort of a vague awareness of it. So soon after graduating, I went off and actually lived for a year in Urumqi and spent time there studying Uyghur and Chinese. And that was what really got me hooked on the place, I suppose. And I also spent a bit of time across the border in the former Soviet Union at that point, which was ultimately really useful because that was where I ended up doing a lot of my research for my PhD. Originally, my interests were, in quite early periods of Central Asian history, but they sort of kept moving forward and, eventually connecting with some political interests in modern history and the Russian Revolution. And it was really noticeable to me that, a lot of the modern history of Xinjiang is very much tied up with what was going on across the border in the Soviet Union. And that was sort of not particularly well known, at least from the standpoint of the historiography of Xinjiang. So that was sort of what led me to my first book. But I also had an interest at that time in the period around the Qing conquest. In fact, I sort of dabbled in that period for a couple of years as a postgraduate student. I guess you could say I'm interested in these transition periods in Central Asian history. And that's obviously one of them. And to try to tell those stories from the local point of view, to the extent possible on the basis of local sources. At the time, I ultimately felt that I didn't really have enough to confidently bite off the 18th century as a dissertation topic, but I did get acquainted with this particular text at that time and spent some time with it. And it was, in a sense, the way I taught myself to read this earlier version of Uyghur, which we call Chagatai, in the 18th century. Really just by sitting with this text and trying to make sense of it and getting some help from some academics. So it always in the back of my mind to go back and try to make something of this and finish it off. It's only been the last couple of years, thanks in large part to a grant that I received from the Australian government, to work more on this this period of before and after the Qing conquest, and to complete and polish up this translation. That was one of the ambitions that I had for this grant. Now I hope to continue working on that period with articles and a monograph and so on. But this is sort of a starting point, I suppose. And as someone who works in a field where there aren't that many scholars out there working, I've always had this sense that one of our responsibilities was to try to make some of these sources a bit more accessible to people as a way of building the field, and not just leaving the source base, in the way that we've found it, but processing this in some way. And so that was it's always been in the back of my mind that doing some translation work would be important for that.
Yeah, and I'm curious. I have a question later in the interview about this, but I'm curious now because you said like while you were a student at Harvard, you first started to grapple with the text. Where was the collection that you were working with at the time? Was this an original manuscript or?
So it's interesting. I mean, one of the people who really laid the foundations for Central Asian studies at Harvard was, of course, Joseph Fletcher, who died relatively young with a lot of unfinished work in train. And I think that one of the things that he had his eye on actually was some kind of study of this text, because he built up a collection of Persian and Chagatai manuscripts from various European libraries that is now kept in the Widener Library. So I had access there to a body of I think 4 or 5 different versions of this manuscript in facsimile already, which was extremely convenient. Of course, saves me the trip, and so that was really how I became aware of this text and was able to get hold of it and read from different versions. I mean, one of the processes in the translation was actually beginning with some shorter versions of the text and then deciding that, I really wanted to, treat the long version, and then trying to work out, well, which of these manuscripts should I be working from? And eventually, I switched the text that I was using as my base on a number of occasions. And so I familiarized myself with a number of these different manuscripts in the Fletcher collection.
That's really interesting. And it just occurred to me, we haven't done a good job yet of introducing the text and the author. So could you tell us a little bit more about who Muhammad Sadiq Kashgari was? What's the kind of cultural and historical context in which he's writing the text? And what do we know about the author and his patrons?
Well, unfortunately, we don't know that much about the author himself. We don't have any reliable secondary sources about his life. So we just have to look at his works and try to construct a story out of that. Now, this text is actually often dated to the 1760s, which is wrong. Actually, I've sort of come to the conclusion that really, if we look at the people who, basically on the basis of the people we know were patronizing this text and their political careers, I think we can confidently say that this was written in the early 1780s. And that was probably one of his earliest works. So we don't know exactly when he probably was someone born around the time of the Qing conquest. So he may not have had, conscious memory of it himself, but he would have grown up with a lot of people, of course, who did. This was sort of very recent history. I've been able to tentatively trace a career for him stretching up until the 1820s. So it's about a 40-year writing career. He was working for this new aristocracy that was created when the Qing came into, what became Xinjiang, into the Tarim Basin. And the various local families who often had a certain aristocratic background or a certain status to begin with, either as tracing their descent from, say, prominent Beg families from the Mongol aristocracy originally, or possibly sort of significant religious lineages, sheikhs of particular shrines, what have you. Certain of these families who were prominent collaborators with the Qing invasion then were created as aristocrats within their system and appointed to positions in the south as governors of these this or that oasis town like Kashgar, Yakand. Kashgari wrote for two of these families. So the family that he's working for when he produces this text is a family from the town of Kucha. Later on, he also does some work for a family from Turfan, which was probably the most powerful of these aristocratic families. This is actually this is really his main let's say original composition. Most of the rest of his work was translation. So he translated sections of historical works such as the Chronicle of Tabari, probably not from the Arabic original, but probably from a Persian translation. He also translated the very important local historical work, the Tarikh-i Rashidi, Mirza Haidar's Persian history of the early part of the Chagatai dynasty in the Tarim Basin. He did. He produced a couple of manuals of ethics and sort of popularizations of Islamic law, kind of what you need to know, to be a good Muslim or to, observe the precepts of Islamic law. He's also credited with a work on retelling the legend of a shrine in Turfan, although his authorship of that work is a little bit in question. And then there are a couple of other works that, are attributed to him, but there's a bit of a question mark around that kind of thing. But what we can say, I think, with some confidence is that he was really one of, if not the main, productive Islamic literati of the early period of the Qing conquest, essentially of the Qianlong Jiaqing periods. His work does, I think the remembrance of the saints, it has a literary quality that connects it to earlier traditions of Chagatai literature, which distinguishes it somewhat, I think, from the type of texts that get written later on in the Qing period, where you get a sense of a little bit more of a rupture with that high Central Asian literary tradition.
Interesting, yeah, and I have a question a little bit later where I want to dive a little bit more into kind of the literary aspect of that text. So thanks for bringing that up. But I'm curious about thinking about this text kind of as a historical source. And here I'm kind of curious what this text can tell us about this period of kind of late, this period just before the Qing expansion, and then also the Qing, under the Qing expansion, and how this, I want to talk a little bit about the Hojaz, like who were these kind of different factions within the Tarim Basin at the time. What does it tell us about the Qing conquest, divisions between those various groups, like I just mentioned, and also the relations with people of the Tarim Basin with the Jungars and the Kyrgyz, as reflected in the text?
Yeah, so those are some of the main themes of the work. So essentially, this is our main source for this period in between the demise of the Chinggisid dynasty in the region, the Chagataids, who are holding on to power up until the late 17th century, and then this window of 50, 60 years prior to the arrival of the Qing dynasty. And this is sometimes characterized as the Hoja period in historiography, because it is the point where these members of these, on the one hand, Sufi brotherhoods, but brotherhoods in which the transmission of leadership has become hereditary. So in a sense, that's why I use the term dynasty, because the preferred model for transmission of the saintly charisma within these Sufi brotherhoods, which once upon a time was, a sort of a master-disciple process, that is, in this period, settled on a hereditary father-son transmission. These families come to prominence as governors of these particular oases. Now, I should say, this designation, the Hodja period, is a little bit controversial. There's been a debate in both Chinese language literature and in Western scholarship as to the reality here of Hodja rule, because we have to keep in mind that we're dealing here with, in the case of this text, a text that sets out to glorify a particular section of this Hodja family, and obviously, play up their significance in this period. So we always have to try to, look out for bits of historical evidence that sort of complicate that narrative. And I think when you do piece together the fragmentary evidence we have from other sources, it's clear that the Hodjas were actors in this period alongside a variety of other sections of the local elite. This is, the fact that we only have one significant source for this period, I think, does tell us something about the turbulence of this period. It really was a kind of a time of troubles in a way, and a lot of that had to do, I think, with the encroachment of nomadic military power on the sedentary society of the Tarim Basin. The two key groups here, of course, the Jungar Mongols, but also the Kyrgyz. And the Kyrgyz, the Jungar Mongols in the text are, on the one hand, and as they are in a lot of Central Asian literature, they are the sort of the enemy par excellence. They are the non-Muslim foe. At the same time, the Hodjas that are at the center of this story did, for certain periods, have quite a stable, mutually beneficial relationship with these Jungar Mongols, and you do get scenes of not necessarily intimacy, but the sort of scenes of interaction that reflect that modus vivendi, I suppose, that they had. We have depictions here of the Jungar court in the Ili region, with the Jungar ruler holding court with Muslim judges, Muslim scholars on one side, and then Buddhist Mongol judges on the other side. And there is a differentiation in the text at certain points between those Jungars who have been, working in the interests of the local Muslims and those who have not. There's the Kyrgyz, of course, ostensibly, we would expect to be treated somewhat differently given their status as Muslims, but in many respects, the invective directed towards the Kyrgyz is almost more extreme than anything about the Jungars, and it is emphasized at various points that if it wasn't for the Jungars, if we got rid of the Jungars, well, then the Kyrgyz would be in here the next minute. So they were equally seen as a threat to the interests of this Muslim community. There's still a lot of work to be done, I think, in terms of actually fleshing out the political dynamics of this period, and even just getting a sort of a basic chronology straight. And unfortunately, Kashgari doesn't provide everything that we would want in that respect, in terms of dating events, that kind of thing. You have to do a bit of triangulation to try to place these events in time. But as more material is becoming available that we can sort of perform that triangulation with, since I began translating this text, for example, the whole Manchu Qing archive on Xinjiang has become available, and a lot of that overlaps with this period. And I use that in my annotations. We can start to, I think we can start to sort of make up for some of the deficiencies of this text as a historical source in its own right.
Yeah, and it's good, and I know that this was a translation, so maybe you kind of put on the translator's cap a little bit and took off the historian's cap. But what I hear in your comments is this real need to understand this as a politically grounded text in itself, that we can't just accept everything in here as fact,
Sure.
but actually that this is coming from a very specific
Yeah.
perspective, and like a pretty extreme one, a moment of intense change, I would say. So that's really interesting, and that kind of brings me to my next question, which is certainly you're not the first. I think you mentioned it in the text, but you're not the first scholar to work with this text. But there's actually a history of scholars working with the text. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that, and how maybe other scholars have approached the text, and how maybe your understanding of it has changed a little bit from kind of the received wisdom.
It's one of these texts that has been known about for really quite a long time, from the 1850s, when the Kazakh in Russian service, Chokan Valikhanov, went to Kashgar, and he sort of got the basic narrative of this text. And then you had British visitors who acquired some manuscripts of this and produced very pre-seed forms of this text. Martin Hartmann, the German Orientalist, did a slightly more extensive version of it. So it's been around for quite a long time, and it's one of these things that's sort of often referenced in relation by these, these précis versions are often referenced in the work. In terms of rethinking the history of this period, one of the things that I was led to in reading this text was to revise our understanding of the nature of the divisions between Sufi brotherhoods in this period. One of the things that I noticed as I was reading this text, we have this conventional understanding of the divisions here into a lineage descended from Hoja Afak, who is buried in Kashgar, and a lineage descended from Hoja Ishaq Vali. Both of them are cousins, basically. And Hoja Ishaq Vali went back to Samarkand and is buried there. And so we have this notion of the Afakiya versus the Ishaqiya. That then gets mapped on to a later set of terminology, which is the White Mountain versus Black Mountain Hodjas. And that then in Chinese discussions becomes White Hat versus Black Hat Hodjas. What I realized as I was translating this text, that these two groups of terminology are not, in fact, synonymous. There is in the text, there's a section of the community around the descendants of Hoja Afak who actually side with the Ishaqiya in the face of this initial Qing invasion, which is supporting a rival faction of this Afakiya community. Now, that all sounds a little bit sort of detailed and nitty-gritty, but what it does is actually allow us to see these categories as things that come into being actually at this particular point in time. So Black Mountain is not something it's not a term that we can just read back into the centuries previous. It's actually something that's sort of created by this reformation of political alliances in the process of the Qing conquest. Now, getting those categories straight then has allowed me to revisit some of the Qing period sources where they talk about this Black Mountain, White Mountain division, and give a new interpretation to some of those sources, and get a better picture of how these Sufi rivalries are actually continuing to play out into the Qing period. I suppose the other thing that I'm interested in dealing with this text that other scholars haven't so much been interested in is, what this actually tells us about the Qianlong period and the period in which this, patrons were trying to essentially sort of establish a master narrative of the conquest period, 20, 30 years after the fact, and trying to understand this text in the context of elite conflicts and rivalries, and as well as an ongoing issue of the relationship between nomadic and sedentary communities. that was part of the history of Qing Xinjiang, not just the period of, preceding that.
Hello, everybody. This is Marshall Poe. I'm the founder and editor of the New Books Network. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably love to read. I know I do. So I'd like to recommend you subscribe to Scribd. Scribd is the ultimate reading subscription service, letting you explore all of your interests in any format you choose, ebooks, audiobooks, magazines, and more for only $9.99 a month. All your favorite things are there. You get an entire library for less than the cost of a single book. No complicated credit cards or additional purchases required. If you're not sure what to read, Scribd combines the latest technology with the best human minds to recommend content that you'll love. Want to change things up? You're free to switch between titles, genres, and formats at any time on your phone, tablet, or computer. And here's the best news. Right now, Scribd is offering NBN listeners a free 60-day trial. Go to try.scribd.com/NBN for your free trial. That's try.scribd.com/NBN to get 60 days of Scribd for free.
Support for this podcast comes from Invent Together. According to studies, less than 13% of all inventors who hold a U.S. patent are women. Black and Hispanic college graduates patent at half the rate of their white counterparts. But we can fix that by increasing participation in innovation and patenting by underrepresented groups. It would quadruple the number of American inventors and increase annual GDP by almost $1 trillion. Invent Together is a coalition of organizations, companies, universities, and concerned citizens committed to ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to invent and patent. Because the more diverse the American patent system gets, the stronger and more successful our nation will become. What can you do to help diverse inventors patent and unleash economic opportunity? Find out at inventtogether.org. Learn more and take action today.
Yeah, and I think on top of that, as you kind of mentioned in the text, like there's kind of a perception that we have that this was an extremely widespread text at the time. I know it's in your introduction. I forget exactly how that discussion goes, but there is plenty of evidence that this was a fairly widespread text. And we've talked a little bit about the kind of historical insights that this text provides, but I'm curious too about if we're thinking about like religious history or like the kind of transmission of Sufism or developments in Sufism. Does the text offer any insights into kind of the nature of Sufism in the Tarim Basin at this time, or maybe even its connection to Sufi networks beyond the Tarim Basin?
There are different redactions of this text, and there's a long version that includes a very lengthy disquisition around the middle on the nature of the both the spiritual lineage that these Sufis have inherited and also the their genealogy as well. Because by this point, the Hodjas were not simply claiming a prestigious chain of spiritual transmission. They've inherited the teachings of Baha'u'llah Naqshband, which are now being said to have continued a tradition from the days of the caliphs, but also claiming Sayyid genealogy as well, which is something that is associated with this shift of this Naqshbandi, this particular branch of the Naqshbandi into the Tarim Basin. But there are other versions of the text where that's actually left out, that's edited out. And so it seems to me that there were readers for whom some of this Sufi doctrinal stuff was really important, and questions of how do you validate someone's claim to Sayyid identity and so on, that was important. And then others for whom this was becoming less salient, because by the 19th century this particular wing of Tarim Basin Sufism was losing out, in a sense, largely thanks to the fact that a lot of them were wiped out by the conquest. But others were moving in from new connections to India and elsewhere. So the text it's very hagiographic in parts, but over the course of the text, it actually becomes a much more worldly kind of narrative. And the Hodjas are joined by various members of the Beg elite as the key actors, and in some cases sort of overshadowing the Hodjas as the key actors. So I understand that as a reflection of the actual sort of social transition that is taking place, and the tension here between a text that is, on the one hand, written to commemorate and glorify these Hodjas, but is not necessarily being written from within the perspective of the Brotherhood, right? It's actually being patronized by people who are, very respectful and, have a sort of social relationship to these Hodjas, but not necessarily, keen to perpetuate the idea of the Sufi sheikh as the holder of power in this context, because of course that runs against the established order in the Qing period. So yeah, I mean, I think in terms of sort of Sufi doctrine and that kind of thing, kind of understanding of Naqshbandi practice and so on, there's not very much of that kind of thing in this text. But in terms of thinking about the image of the sheikh and the nature of saintly power, I think that there is quite a lot to look at from the depictions of these Hodjas.
Yeah, and I kind of want to bridge that conversation a little bit and talk about kind of some of the literary aspects of the text, because you talked about how in some ways it's hagiographic, but then it kind of has this kind of world literature kind of narrative to it, especially as you move throughout the text. And I want to talk about the original title, which is Tazkirai Azizon. And so literally, like, you're translating Tazkira, I guess, as remembrance or some kind of. So could you talk a little bit about the decision with the title, like in remembrance of the saints, and what is a Tazkira, and is this a literary genre in itself, or I think you've kind of indicated that this is some kind of hybrid in a way, but maybe it is building on a bigger tradition, right?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that it is anomalous in a certain sense when we talk about genre, but then I would just say that most texts actually do show signs of abnormality when we try to fit them into simple understandings of genres like hagiography or so on. I mean, Tazkira can mean, I mean, just to sort of focus in on the context of the 18th century in Xinjiang, I would say that connotes a sort of a family of different types of texts that, on the one hand, you have quite classical Tazkira texts, which are, compilations of the lives of Sufi saints, Tazkiratul Awliya, those types of texts that are, go back to the 12th century and, really established classics of Central Asian literature that you don't have to necessarily adopt any particular position in relation to this. That's just part of the Islamic tradition writ large. Tazkira is also, refers to particular texts that produced within circles of Sufi disciples, to promote particular sheikhs or particular interpretations of the Sufi path. And they would sometimes be compilative, sometimes centered on particular individual saint, sometimes approaching a kind of a biography, but often constructed out of anecdotes that are not necessarily in chronological order. The key thing here is still, the wisdom that is imparted by the the teachings or the actions of the saint in these little stories. Then you have the something quite prominent in the Tarim Basin is these various shrine texts that are coming into being sort of in a I think a sort of a dialectical way, in the way that certain locations in the Tarim Basin become identified with particular stories, and then those stories kind of take on written form, and then the written form of those stories kind of reinforces the narratives around these locations, so on. So various sort of semi-mythical saints in the region, often associated with the Islamization of the region. And these texts can be quite, let's say, sort of vernacular in style, often coming in manuscripts that have clearly been kind of produced on the cheap, copyists not being very sort of fastidious about their handwriting and so on. It's quite a sort of a popular style of text. So Kashgari sort of comes in to this, and he's using that term tazkira, and I mean the first few sections of the work are him translating and adapting other hagiographies. So that's how he sort of sets the scene. He's taking from earlier Persian hagiographies of this Naqshbandi tradition, particularly the Makhdumi Azam, this important Samarkandi sheikh, and then Ishaq Vali. But let me say this. Within the long version of the text, I already talked about the long and the short versions briefly, but within the long and the long version itself, there is a distinction between certain texts that adopt quite a sectarian attitude, which is sort of quite sort of, traditional in the sense of, we got the spiritual charisma, not those, that rival lineage. But that, I think, is a subsequent adaptation of this text. The text that I work from is actually quite ecumenical in its approach to these things. So when it gets to this key sort of branching between the lines of Hoja Afaq and Hoja Ishaq Vali, it actually says, well, some people say that, it went this way. The partisans of Hoja Afaq say that, they inherited it, via this way. And then it says, well, look, it's, God only knows, but, it's probably the case that, both of these lineages have some share of this tradition, right? So in that sense, it's kind of trying to bridge a bit of the divide here, which is quite interesting. And again, I think reflects the fact that Kashgari himself, the author, is not part of a network that is actually sort of pushing on these sectarian disputes in a serious way. I mean, in a sense, I think what the sort of the Beg elite in the Qianlong period would have wanted would actually be to sort of tone things down a bit, and kind of put a wrap on some of the hostilities that had, presumably been seen as part of the, what had led to this, period of outside domination.
Certainly, especially after this, as you said, incredibly turbulent period. It's definitely not hard to imagine. Thank you for that. And I don't know, I'd like to shift our conversation a little bit, because this is in some ways, even for the channel, this is a bit of a unique text. As I said, we've had other translators working with Central Asian texts on the channel before, but it has been a while. So I wanted to kind of take the opportunity to talk with you a little bit about the process of translation. And we've alluded to this a little bit, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about the various kind of versions of the text that exist, where those are held. I know, if I remember correctly, there were texts in Germany, like copies of the text in Germany that you were able to access, maybe digitally. And I know that there was a mention of the Al-Biruni archive or kind of manuscript collections. I might be pronouncing
Yep.
that institution, but in Tashkent, right, in Uzbekistan.
Yes.
So I'd be curious, like, if you worked with different texts, like, did you see differences between them? And if you could just like share a little bit of that experience, I think it's really a unique one that we don't hear about very often.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I originally, I do have a file of the transcription of the text with, making notes of various different readings and, different parts of the text and so on. And originally I was thinking of publishing that alongside the translation, but ultimately it just seemed to me that it was actually very difficult to come to any kind of conclusion about which of these texts was closer to the original. I sort of ended up drawing on some of these kind of circumstantial considerations about Kashgari and his patrons and so on to, ultimately I ended up working with the text that is the most well represented of the long version of the text. As I said, there's another version of the long text which shows a more sort of partisan viewpoint, and then there's the shorter version which is also goes by the title of Tazkire Hojagan, the remembrance of the Hodjas. That's also the way it's known. You're right. There are texts, St. Petersburg, the Jaring collection in Lund, in Staatsbibliothek in Berlin. There's some in Oxford, at the Bodleian. There's a couple in Tashkent, and then there are texts in China. Still, we know some are in collections in Xinjiang. There was actually a modern Uyghur version of this published a couple of decades ago as well. But it's also the case that there are texts still in private hands. I've seen copies of this text in private hands. Now, exactly how many of those texts are still out there, we don't know, and it may ultimately be very hard for us to know, because possession of those kinds of texts today is becoming a dangerous thing for people there. So I do worry about the preservation of texts in Xinjiang at the moment. So what I ended up doing in the translation was basically to try to note, where there are significant additions or subtractions of meaningful information across the body of texts, right? So you're not going to get a guide to every slight difference between the text, but where I thought, people are adding new information, or that this particular story is being told in a slightly different way, then I certainly did make note of that. And I was helped in that by the recent work of the Japanese scholar Sawada Minoru, who's done a Japanese translation of the short version, which is very well annotated as well. So when I need to sort of refer to divergences with the short version, I can sort of point people to his work as well. One good thing is that in some of these collections, particularly Jaring and in Berlin as well, the text is starting to be digitized. And so we do actually have texts that are readily available in digital version. And ultimately, that was also a factor for me in thinking about, whether or not I wanted to try and actually publish the text or something like that. In the end, I sort of decided that the benefit of just doing a straight translation is, to be able to place it in a publisher's series where it's going to be relatively affordable. It's going to, it's going to be the kind of thing that, undergraduates could potentially buy and work with in courses and so on. Whereas, something that has all the sort of, the sort of the heavy philological feel of a text edition as well as a translation, well, that that makes it quite a different kind of thing. The difficulty, of course, is that when you do that, you can't translate knowing that, readers are going to be able to, people who are in the know or a little bit, unsure about your translation, they're going to be able to refer to the original text. And ultimately, I didn't even have footnotes for the translation, which meant that I really had to try to make it something that people could just read through without being able to sort of jump down to the bottom of page and get some clarification about what this particular term means or that kind of thing. So that was a little bit daunting, I have to say. And, I can't say for sure that I met that challenge in every instance.
Yeah, thank you. And that kind of like actually brings me to my next question, which was kind of like who you imagined the audience of the text being, and also what kind of challenges, I don't know, was there any like unexpected challenges you face in bringing this text into kind of a modern global English, especially one that, like you said, is something that you can imagine like undergraduate students reading and really getting something out of Central Asian history by reading the text. Like, I think this is a really cool way to develop the project, but I'm curious, like, what kind of challenges are waiting for others of us who might do a similar type of project?
I mean, speaking sort of concretely about the translation, it is the case that we're sort of at the mercy of the copyists in terms of what we are actually working from. And I think what has happened with the Tazkira Azizan is that, well, Kashgari himself would have been very, I think, well trained in Arabic and Persian and so on. We have copyists who, wouldn't necessarily have that kind of training. And so there are certain elements of the text, for example, the Persian poetry, that tends to get corrupted quite quickly. And there are just these kinks in the text that I couldn't really iron out. For example, there's a passage where the whole story turns on the interpretation of a particular line of Persian verse from an Indian poet. But the line in the text, in all the versions of the text, is not actually the same line as it is in the divan of this poet. And in the way that it's represented in Kashgari's text, it's very hard to make sense of the anecdote or the sort of the puzzle of interpretation that they're playing with. And ultimately there wasn't a huge amount I could do with that. There are issues like that. I mean, I have to say, like, the Persian poetry was a particular challenge, even when I was confident in, a reading, because this is the period of the influence of the poetry of India in sort of 16th, 17th century poetry. This is known as the Sabki Hindi poetry, which is, incredibly dense in its metaphors. I think, I mean, there's always challenges about questions of terminology. How much do you want to translate? Key words about, to do with sainthood and, themes of holy war and that kind of thing. Do you leave jihad as jihad, with the sort of modern connotations that people might have of that, or do you translate that as something? Same with Sharia. Modern readers, they have a certain notion of Sharia and what that means. Is it best to just rely on that, or should we use some English term for that? Those were kinds of questions that I grappled with.
Yeah, I think this is always a question of, there is a certain effect of keeping certain words in the original, and, like Hoja is one that comes to mind that obviously is important for your purposes. But yeah, I think those are just kind of some important things to grapple with.
Mm.
Yeah, and kind of building on that, I was curious. I know you mentioned in the footnotes that there were some that you did turn to some kind of I guess like inspirations or kind of guides to dealing with aspects of Arabic or Persian literature that were popping up. But in general, was it, thinking about the translation process again, was there any kind of text that came before you that served as kind of an ideal or that shaped the way that you approach the text, or was it just kind of like jumping into water feet first?
Well, I mean, there's lots of good translations out there. I mean, I had the privilege of working with Wheeler Thaxton for a time. We sat down at a couple of points with a few passages from this text, and that was I mean, his work has always influenced me. There are really sort of stunning renditions of Persian poetry out there, Dick Davis and those kind of people that I try to look at anything that they do, and I feel very inadequate, not having the sort of poetic skills in English to try to do more of the of that type of translation. But no, I think it was really, I think the key was trying to think about, to go back to the sort of the question of genre, try to think about how to characterize what I was reading. I mean, the term hagiography does a lot of work, but towards the end, I mean, there is a kind of an epic style to the second half as well. Kashgari is using phrases that we can see the sort of there are certain linguistic parallels between the language he's using and the language that he's using in the translations of those histories, for example, that I mentioned. And he talks about the sections as dastan, which is, that's not hagiographic terminology. That is, that's much more, from the epic tradition. There's, I mean, I like the term martyrology as well. There's just this kind of pervading sense of doom throughout the text, and people are often sort of predicting their impending demise, and that obviously specifically is a genre that has a long history as well. I mean, one thing I hope is that people with a better grasp of some of these traditions of Islamic religious literature going all the way back might be able to come along and look at a text like this now that we have the sort of the whole, and offer interpretations on that from that sort of vantage point, because it was something that I was often found myself wondering, the various stories around, the flight of these saintly figures from the enemy and so on. I mean, there's a long tradition of that kind of thing. And in fact, Kashgari does reference Muhammad's flight from Mecca at a certain point at the end as well. But I would imagine that there's a lot more that could be said about that side of the text as well.
Yeah, David, we're nearing the end of time here, but I wanted to kind of come back to another comment you made earlier when you were talking about these texts kind of existing in private hands, and also one aspect of your work that I don't think you've talked about too much yet, which is that you began your study of Uyghur or Chagatai in Xinjiang, and I can't help but bring us to the conversation about what's happening in Xinjiang today, and specifically, what does it mean to translate a text like this at a time when, as you say in your acknowledgments, many Uyghur scholars and translators have vanished or are vanishing, and in internment camps in Xinjiang. So yeah, just a couple of words about that.
Yeah, well, it's a heavy question. I obviously, I wasn't thinking along these lines when I sort of first set out to work on this text in 15 odd years ago. Although even then, I mean, there was some sense that this was a neglected part of the Islamic world, and that I mean, I certainly always felt that Uyghur colleagues appreciated the fact that people were taking some interest in this, and I certainly don't want to overstate the contribution that work like this can make in a in a situation like we are in today. But I do think that there is this this huge interest out there now in the identity, the culture, the history of the Muslim peoples of this region, and there's actually very little for the people to sort of do with that interest in an intellectual sense. There's not a huge amount in translation, and if people want to pick up something that was written by someone from the region, there's still not a great deal that we can point people to. Now, I mean, I think that interest would probably best be served by translating some of the modern literature as well. But nonetheless, I do think that it's I was quite appreciative that Columbia University Press took interest in this project and were happy to slot this into a body of work that is, identified as, classics of Asian literature and so on. Because I think, in the Central Asian context, this really does deserve to be considered as a classic. And I mean, as I talked about the manuscripts, I mean, I do very much worry about the fate of Islamic studies inside China today, and the ability for people to study and engage with these kinds of texts. I won't say that it's a completely dead tradition. I mean, I think that in some parts of China, this is still sort of surviving, but I think there's a huge amount of pressure now on really any effort to maintain and elaborate a Uyghur cultural and intellectual tradition that has a connection to this this tradition of Islamic literature. That is, I think, endangered, and so and I have various colleagues that have helped me out along the way in Xinjiang now, who have been missing for 2 to 3 years, and I very much hope it's not the case, but we know now that China is transitioning away from this sort of so-called re-education camp internment, but putting a lot of people away in lengthy prison sentences. And I really hope that's not the case. And I think that whatever else we might be doing, in response to this situation, that the Academy needs to remember that we have colleagues, facing that really dire plight in China at the moment, and remember that and call attention to it in whatever way we can.
Absolutely, thank you. And as we're kind of ending the conversation, you mentioned earlier, in when you were talking about the translation, that this is perhaps a start of more historical scholarly work. So back to doing research on this period of the Qing conquest. So I'm curious, do you have any other projects in the work that we should look out for?
Well, I mean, maybe not something to look out for immediately, but as I said, I have been working on this period, not just as a translator, but I've been digging into the Qing sources. I've been scrounging around for manuscript texts that can help to flesh out the picture of sort of the wider picture of the Tarim Basin Sufism in this period, its relationship to politics and the state, and it's led me in some interesting directions. I have some unfinished work at the moment on one particular branch of this family who ended up in Beijing, for example, as members of the Qing aristocracy, but living in Beijing, who were nonetheless continuing to write their own Sufi hagiographies and, try to maintain this sense of, being inheritors of this Naqshbandi tradition, while living, in the hutongs of Beijing. And that to me is well, I think it's an interesting sort of addition to our understanding of the relationship between the Qing Empire and Islam in this period. As I said, I'm also still sort of trying to explore some of the continuation of these Sufi networks in the post-conquest period. I mean, despite the fact that a lot of, they were largely decapitated in that process, there were groups that went back to kind of master-disciple forms of transition and so on, and we can sort of tell a bit of a story about them into the 19th century. So, I mean, really what I would like eventually is to zoom out and be able to probably write some kind of monograph on the sort of the story of Sufism and the state from sort of 17th through to 19th, possibly even 20th centuries. But there's a little bit of way to go on that. Still, I've also been, writing quite a bit on contemporary Australia-China politics of late. So I have a book coming out on the whole Australia-China debate, and that has taken me away from some of this work a little bit, although it does have a whole chapter on the discussion around Xinjiang in it as well. So
great. So yeah. we'll look out for both. One sooner and one a bit later. Yeah. And so now, we've been talking for the last hour about you and your work, but I have a question for you, which is, could you share something that maybe you've read of someone else's work, whether it's in Central Asian studies or, I don't know, something else that you found interesting and that readers might enjoy?
Well, I guess if you've got to the end of this interview, you probably do have an interest in 18th century Central Asia, and I feel like we are, we're at a point now where there's always a bit of a dialogue going on between people who work on Western Turkestan, people who work on Eastern Turkestan, and across the other side of the border in Western Turkestan, the scholarship is a bit richer. There's a bit more going on, but I think that some of the work that's being done there could be extended in interesting ways into Xinjiang. I mean, I'm thinking about Scott Levy's recent Bukharan crisis, which I thought was a really stimulating discussion of that period, and has could I think serve as a platform for a range of interesting discussions about Xinjiang and the Qing conquest. I mean, Jeff Eden's book on slavery is also, I think, something that we should be reading. I haven't mentioned it, but one of the consequences of this period of Junga Mongol domination was a whole lot of slavery, enslavement of Muslims by Mongols and enslavement of Mongols by Muslims. I mean, of course, the Kalmucks, were slaves throughout the rest of Central Asia, but there was a lot of back and forth between these communities in the Tarim Basin. The final thing that I hope he's okay with me sort of mentioning this, because it is publicly available, but amazingly, we now have really the first kind of study of the Junga state, the Junga Mongol state, from an internal point of view. That is to say, one that really begins with the process of Junga Mongol state building and then kind of looking outward from that perspective. This is Hosong Shim's dissertation, which was recently completed at Indiana University. And this is something that I think, fills a gap. It will fill a gap certainly when it becomes published as a monograph. And it's kind of just the kind of thing that I've been looking for as a historian, essentially of Islamic Central Asia and the Tarim Basin in particular, to now be able to kind of think about these societies as not simply as places that sort of get squeezed between the Qing and Russian empires, but as places that had a political economy and had elites with their political strategies and so on, and this sort of contact zone between the steppe and Islamic Central Asia, between the sort of the Mongol and Muslim worlds, is one of these important interactions that has just never been really well studied and understood. And because, of course, we have to remember, when the Qing step into Central Asia in the 18th century, they're not entering this space of pristine, Islamic rule, never before, defiled by non-Muslim domination. I mean, no, this has been a space of interaction between non-Muslim rulers and these Muslim city-states for a long time prior to that point. And I think having a clearer picture of that can ultimately inform our understanding of Qing imperialism in that space as well.
Absolutely. And yeah, so thank you for those recommendations. And for listeners, we did actually feature this book by Scott Levi here on the channel, so also please check that out if you're interested. And David, thanks again for coming and talking about the translation. We'll have some info in the description about where listeners can get that book. So thanks again.
Thanks, Nick. I enjoyed it.